In chapter 23, the second video will pick up with cholera. This disease that we do not see in the US affects regions of the world affected by natural disasters and in refugee camps where sewage treatment and clean drinking water are not readily available. The causative agent is the gram-negative curved bacteria known as Vibrio cholera. Cholera is a very devastating epidemic and sometimes pandemic infection. Unlike Shigella, where the infectious dose was quite low, for cholera you actually have to ingest quite a few, around 1 million, bacterial cells to acquire the infection. What happens is that somebody that's ill is shedding very many organisms and it can contaminate the water supply. When this infection, what happens is that the individual will experience a very watery, very copious amount of fluid diarrhea. The diarrhea has a characteristic appearance which is known as rice water stool. It's given the designation because the victims are basically losing huge amounts of fluid from their GI tract. Their body is just releasing all this fluid, and tiny little flecks of mucous membrane will be coming out with this watery diarrhea. These little flecks are said to resemble grains of rice, and hence the name. When the individual is losing so much fluid, they can die of dehydration. During outbreaks of cholera, patients really require only basic types of support. If the individual can be given access to IV fluids, they can survive the infection. Without this treatment, their mortality rate is extremely high. Half the people suffering from cholera will die, and they're dying of dehydration. This figure from your book is showing what the fluid loss occurs. It's caused by the effects of the cholera toxin that it has on the cells of the GI epithelium. I'm not going to require you to know this cycle, but by examining the figure, you can see the physiological effect of the toxin and the result of releasing ions, which pull water into the GI tract. The individual will lose water and electrolytes in very large amounts, and the person may die of dehydration. Treatment is pretty much supportive. Antimicrobials are not needed, but rehydration is. In this gram stain, you can see these slightly curved gram-negative rods, which are typical of the Vibrio genus. Here, in this makeshift treatment facility in a refugee camp, you can see a fairly simple-looking setup. Can you see that below each cot there are buckets? Do you see there's a hole in the cot which is covered in plastic? The patient is basically allowed to just experience the effects of the infection and will lose fluid which is collected in the buckets. The staff of the treatment facility try to dispose of it in a manner that isn't going to contaminate the water supply. Here you can see that they have IV poles set up so that they can rehydrate the patient. That's a summary of cholera, a devastating epidemic causing bacterial infection of the GI tract. Moving on to intoxications. An intoxication is not an infection. Bacteria are not multiplying in the GI tract. It's the ingested toxin itself that's causing the signs and symptoms. One of the most prevalent foodborne illnesses is caused by Staphylococcus aureus. It's only the toxin produced by some strains of staph that causes the problem. The toxin is a very heat-stable molecule, so once the toxin is produced in the food, even if you heat up or boil the food, you're not going to get rid of the toxin. After you ingest the food contaminated with the toxin, you're going to end up with a foodborne illness. Here, the danger is if a food becomes contaminated by being left out on the counter where the organism is multiplying and producing the toxin, but then you decide you better heat up the food before you eat it, you're not going to destroy the toxin. You're still going to get sick. The effect of the toxin is to cause the typical cramps, nausea, and vomiting that go along with the gastroenteritis. The effect is usually fairly short-lived. Within 24 hours, you feel a lot better because the toxin has been cleared from your system. This intoxication is associated with social functions. The diagnosis is signs and symptoms. Usually you don't need to be treated because your body will clear it out. If someone becomes extremely dehydrated, then they may need fluid replacement, but that's about it. The important point here is that the toxin is produced by specific strains of S. aureus, and this toxin is very heat stable, so you're not going to destroy it by heating the food before serving it. Next infection is mumps, which is covered by the MMR vaccine. MMR covers measles, mumps, and rubella. The mumps virus primarily infects the salivary glands. Can you see this infected child has extremely swollen area around the neck where the salivary glands are located? The organism can also infect the testes, your meninges, pancreas, central nervous system. So the damage can be more widespread. I know one former student that had acquired mumps as a kid, and it caused deafness in one ear. So yes, it can damage the auditory nerve, and it can lead to male infertility during infection of the testes. Immunization programs have been fairly successful, but people that don't get boosters may in fact come down with the infection. I had a pretty close friend come down with a fairly mild case of mumps in her 40s. When she went to the doctor, she couldn't understand what was going on with all the swelling in her neck. She didn't feel well. She ended up being diagnosed with mumps, and although she had been vaccinated, she hadn't been boosted in many decades, so her immune response obviously had waned. Her infection was mild, but nevertheless she was infected. It has not disappeared or been eradicated at this point. I'm not going to go into detail about viral gastroenteritis. These infections are pretty common. The viruses cause the same sorts of symptoms that the agents of bacterial gastroenteritis do. Abdominal cramping, diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, all of the typical signs and symptoms you associate with gastroenteritis. There are some common causes, and one viral cause, rotavirus, has a vaccine available, which is important in the US because it has greatly reduced childhood hospitalizations here, but worldwide it's very important since, as I mentioned earlier, diarrheal diseases cause a large number of childhood deaths across the globe. A vaccine helps prevent this. We will now move on to viral hepatitis. There are several different viruses that cause hepatitis. Hepatitis is inflammation of the liver, so as you might guess, these viruses primarily infect liver cells, hepatic cells. Some of them are transmitted by the fecal-oral route, and others are acquired through blood-borne transmission. We're going to look at these different types of viruses and what they do. There's actually a table in your book that's helpful. For hepatitis, the absolutely most important sign is jaundice. Jaundice is yellowing of the skin and eyes. Jaundice is diagnostic for hepatitis, but in addition, the patient is probably experiencing vomiting, a loss of appetite, a feeling of fatigue, and nausea. Lots of different symptoms go along with hepatitis, but sometimes, at least for some of these infections that are more chronic, the symptoms may not appear for years after the initial infection. The infection is slowly accumulating damage over the years. It's estimated that there are a lot of what we call the baby boomers that are infected, that got infected maybe back in the 60s and 70s because of things they were engaged in back in those days. These individuals never realized that they were infected and only now are beginning to experience the signs and symptoms and get diagnosed. I know it's becoming routine for physicians to run a blood test and check for hepatitis C, which does not have a vaccine available. There are two different strains of hepatitis, A and E, that are transmitted via the fecal-oral route. There is a vaccine for hepatitis A. The table shows that hepatitis B, C, and D are transmitted via the blood or by sexual transmission. Sharing needles, sexual relations will spread this infection. Serological testing is used to figure out which virus a person is suffering from. There are vaccines available only to hepatitis A and hepatitis B. For the other viruses, there's no vaccine. There are drugs available for hepatitis that were not previously available. These can really help individuals that are suffering from hepatitis, but it's not a cheap drug. Hepatitis A, B, C, D, and E are outlined in this table. A and E are the ones that are transmitted by the fecal-oral, and the other three are via the blood-borne or sexually transmitted route. Hepatitis B and C tend to be chronic. They cause long-term infections, which are also associated with liver cancer. Interestingly, hepatitis D only infects people that are also simultaneously infected with hepatitis B. I circled it in red so that you can see that. So in order to have hepatitis D, you have to also be co-infected with hepatitis B. Unfortunately, if you're infected with both B and D at the same time, the prognosis is not very good. It's experienced as a more severe infection, worse than just having hepatitis B alone. Luckily, there is a vaccine against hepatitis B, so if you're vaccinated and you get your boosters and you have protection against hepatitis B, you can avoid this infection altogether. I recommend taking a look at this table and be able to differentiate the different causes of viral hepatitis. We'll talk next about a common protozoal GI infection. Giardia is a protozoal organism that hopefully is fairly familiar to you. We've looked at it in the lab. Giardia intestinalis is the new name, but it was formerly known as Giardia lamblia. There are quite a few references, and in fact, I think our slides in lab are labeled as Giardia lamblia. These are the same. Giardia intestinalis is just the more recent official species designation. The thing about this eukaryote is that you ingest cysts. Cysts are the environmentally stable infectious form of the pathogen. Once ingested, it gets into your intestine and becomes that metabolizing form that's called a trophozoite. Remember the drawing project? The trophozoite is that metabolizing form of various protozoa, and that's the stage that's doing the damage inside your GI tract. The signs and symptoms for this protozoal infection are still the typical signs of gastroenteritis, right? The nausea, the vomiting, the cramping, the diarrhea. But the diarrhea, let's say it's something special. It's really bad. The diarrhea is greasy, frothy, and the most foul-smelling substance you can imagine. If you've ever had a pet that's suffering from Giardia, you know what I'm talking about. Or maybe you were unfortunate enough to acquire it yourself. This is a very terrible smelling diarrhea with very greasy, frothy nature. Unfortunately, I let my dog drink out of a creek when we went hiking, and he got Giardia from that. You know, I would never drink out of a creek, but I wasn't thinking about my dog, and I let him drink out of it. I won't do that again. That was the most nasty infection ever. The mess he made was pretty terrible, but he got over the infection with treatment. There are drugs like metronidazole, the same as for trichomonas. This image over here looks similar to things that you were drawing in the laboratory. And here's a scanning electron micrograph of the parasite. You can see how it has a sucker on the bottom to attach to your intestinal epithelium. We're going to move on to the last group of organisms in the chapter, the larger parasites. The helminths are the flat, segmented, multicellular worm-like organisms. There's various tapeworms that are potential causes of GI distress in individuals. Here you can see a scolex, like we drew in the lab. Many species have hooks as well as suckers to anchor themselves to the wall of the intestine. They have these segments that are filled with egg-producing ovaries as well as testes. They can self-fertilize their eggs. Then, as the segments break off, the eggs can be released. Eggs are shed in the feces. Tapeworms are helminths that cause problems in humans and animals. Here's the pork tapeworm that can cause serious infections in people. The biggest issue really is not the tapeworm in the GI tract, but the eggs that are released and then can be re-ingested. The eggs hatch and the larvae migrate through the intestinal epithelium and travel to the tissues. The tissues cause what are known as cystoceri. These are little cysts that are formed in the muscles and other tissues, including the brain. These cystoceri then cause an inflammatory response. A person with a tapeworm can self-contaminate by shedding eggs and feces and then accidentally ingesting the eggs because of less than ideal hygienic practices. Such individuals will then have both a tapeworm and cystoceri. These can be very serious infections. The last infection of the chapter is actually a really common infection caused by a nematode, which are these little worm-like structures you see here. In case you're wondering, yes, that's an anus. So what happens during this infection is that the organism gets into the GI tract after someone ingests eggs. Then the eggs hatch and exist in your GI tract. The adult female worm will move out to the anal opening and deposit eggs at night while you're sleeping. The eggs cause some itching. An infected individual will feel anal itching, and on the perianal region, the eggs can survive a couple of weeks. Eggs are obviously transmitted via the fecal oral route. Kids often pick up this infection because kids don't usually have especially hygienic practices. They put their hands in their mouth after handling dirty things, and if there are infected people around, then they can get infected with these pinworms. The diagnosis is pretty low tech, really. It's typically made in one of two ways. One is seeing the eggs under a microscope. A swab of the anal area or a piece of Scotch tape is pressed over the anus and then stuck to a slide to examine whether eggs can be seen. The second method is even more low-tech. This is usually done by a parent. This is the flashlight test. A parent, armed with a flashlight, examines the anus of a sleeping child in the night and tries to see if any of these thread-like worms are moving around the anal area. Yes, true. It's low-tech, but an easy way to verify the infection. Find the females in the act of laying the eggs. Yeah, I know. Being a parent requires all kinds of heroics for the benefit of your kid. This is just another example of parents answering the call of duty. Pinworm infection is a very common infection in the United States. There's like 40 million infections every year. It's not something that's uncommon. It's very common, especially in kids. If someone in the household is infected, it's likely that the rest of the household should be treated as well, because it's not that difficult to spread around amongst people in the family. Well, this concludes the infections we'll cover in Chapter 23. That's all, folks. One more to go.